Welcome, friends and enemies, to the Castlecast. A channel where we talk about dungeon synth, dark ambient, and electronic fantasy music. I'm your host, Kevin in Hell, and today we're going to talk about the relationship between music and fantasy. And for this video, to save being too redundant, when I talk about fantasy, I'm also including science fiction and horror under this umbrella. More than any other genre of music, dungeon synth at its very core is intertwined with fantasy. Swords, dragons, and castles adorn the covers of some of our favorite albums, and the creators of this music often photograph themselves with maces, axes, and goblin-like appearances. Album titles like Path of a Tongueless Knight and Spellwind sound like their own series of fantasy novels. Today, we look at the role of fantasy music in dungeon synth and why the two work so well together. Fantasy literature has had its influence on music for a very long time. King Arthur and his knights were a frequent topic for troubadours and minstrels in their songs and poems dating back to the 12th and 13th century. In the 16th century, a style of music coming out of Germany was called Fantasia, which would frequently be heavily improvised and would have two different melodies played over top of each other. This style would remain popular well into the 1800s. And while the style of music had little to do with the 1940 Disney movie of the same name, that film would be an important stepping stone in using a classical sounding score to enhance animation and bring to life the atmospheres of these worlds. Just try and tell me that The Sorcerer's Apprentice or Night on Bald Mountain aren't a building block for dungeon synth. Now, there is one series of literature that would change the face of fantasy, art, and music forever, and of course, that is the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. The Hobbit in 1937 and The Lord of the Rings in 1954 set off the imaginations of everyone who would read them. Poems like The Road Goes Ever On from The Hobbit or The Fall of Gil-galad from The Fellowship of the Ring live in these novels and cement this relationship between music and literature. In 1967, an album called Poems and Songs of Middle-earth would be released featuring interpretations of some of the songs from the series performed by opera singer William Elvin. Yes, William Elvin. Tolkien himself would also recite several poems for this album. By 1969, the influence of The Lord of the Rings was everywhere in music. Swedish progressive rock musician Bo Hansson would record an instrumental album of music inspired by Lord of the Rings. That same year, Joni Mitchell would release a song, I Think I Understand, that references Tolkien with the line, Fear is like the Wilderland, a song inspired by the elven character Galadriel.
Fear is like a wilderland, stepping stones or sinking sand.
Of course, Led Zeppelin is famous for referencing the series in songs like Ramble On,
Just in the darkest depths of Mordor, I met a girl so fair, but got him at the evil wall, crept up and slipped away with her.
Misty Mountain Hot,
I didn't notice, but it had got very dark and I was really
and The Battle of Evermore.
with flames from the dragon of darkness, the sunlight blinds his eyes.
Jack Bruce from Cream had a song on his 1970 solo album called To Isengard.
I'm gonna
Sabbath would credit the inspiration for the track The Wizard to Gandalf.
Misty morning, clouds in the sky. Without warning, a wizard walks by. Casting his shadow, weaving his spell. On great clothes, twinkling bell.
Rush and Camel would also have their own crack at Middle-earth in the 70s with Rivendell,
Elven songs and endless nights, sweet wine and soft, relaxing lights. Time will never touch you.
and Nimrodel.
When he rides, my fears subside, for darkness turns once more to light. Through the skies is wide.
By the time The Silmarillion was published in 1977, almost 5 years after Tolkien's death, we learn of the immense connection between music and his world. The start of The Silmarillion acts as a creation story for the fantasy world Tolkien has created, and he reveals that the universe, called Ea, is brought into existence by the harmonious voices of the Ainur. Despite the efforts of soon-to-be villain Melkor, who tries to sing in disharmony because he also wants to be able to create something of his own instead of being an instrument of someone else. Another band famous for introducing synthesizers to the mainstream audience was Pink Floyd, and their 1967 album Piper at the Gates of Dawn is a reference to The Wind in the Willows, a fantasy novel by Kenneth Grahame.
A gnome named Grimble Grumble, and little gnomes stay in their homes, eating, sleeping, drinking their wine.
By the time the 80s rolled around, fantasy was in full swing. Slews of fantasy stories were being turned into movies, and the epic tales required equally epic orchestral arrangements, such as Conan the Barbarian. Horror and sci-fi films started using synthesizers heavily in their film scores to create otherworldly sounds and effects like Vangelis's Blade Runner, or John Carpenter's Halloween. And we have to point out, especially with the horror movies of the 80s, it was simply way cheaper to score a movie on a synthesizer than bringing in an orchestra, and the result of this budget-friendly, lower fidelity option would bring a feeling, style, and ambience of its own. Another new medium was on the rise that would also have a deep and long-lasting impact on both fantasy and music, and that was the popularity of video games. The music from 1986's The Legend of Zelda by Koji Kondo was produced with synthesizers that could play on the first generation of consoles, and this music helped define the game, the franchise, and the era. This music was so iconic that it was turned into a full orchestra version some 25 years later. Also in 1986, the first Castlevania game comes out, and the influence of this soundtrack was so great that there are multiple acts that make music that try to give off this same vibe using vintage Casio synthesizers. listen to the score of Skyrim, it might as well be a dungeon synth album. Fantasy art has also gone hand in hand with music, especially heavy metal, since the very beginning. Pick just about any metal album cover from the 80s, and you can see the influence of Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo all over them. Again, Tolkien would have his works interpreted by this generation of metal bands, with groups like Cirith Ungol, taking their name from the lair of the giant spider Shelob, and Blind Guardian, releasing several songs and albums about Tolkien's works. Another very important connection to make between fantasy and dungeon synth is Enya's 1991 album Shepherd Moons, with the track Lothlorien, an ambient instrumental song that tries to transport you to the mythical elven kingdom. Proto-dungeon synth artist Jim Kirkwood would use synthesizers and drum machines to convey fantastical images of adventure and dread on albums like Master of Dragons or Where Shadows Lie. And with that, everything is in place for the beginnings of black metal, and by extension, dark dungeon music. I could be here all day talking about the black metal bands named for Tolkien characters or locales: Gorgoroth, Burzum, Isengard, Summoning, Shagrath. The list is seemingly endless. Again, black metal album art would conjure fantasy worlds like In the Nightside Eclipse by Emperor, or Dissection's The Somber Lane. This trend would permeate the world of dungeon synth. Secret Stairways would release their dungeon synth masterpiece, Enchantment of the Ring, in 1997, and 20 years later, Thangorodrim would release Gil Estel. Outside of Tolkien, Caladan Brood took its name from the Malazan series by Steven Erikson, and the project Atrium of Time is based off the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, which is actually what I am currently reading and listening to. So obviously, fantasy literature and storytelling have had a massive influence on music since, well, forever. But why is it so intrinsically hand in hand with dungeon synth? Well, I have a theory about that. Now, while bands like Led Zeppelin, Rush, and Blind Guardian are drawing on this fantasy work for their music lyrically, dungeon synth and other ambient artists are instead creating the fantasy. When you listen to that first Mortis album, just looking at the artwork and knowing his image, you can close your eyes and be transported to a completely new fantasy world that your brain makes up as you let the tone and the tension of the music overtake you. Prolific French dungeon synth artist Orang is a perfect example of this. His music and album titles are all about letting your imagination take the lead and bring you into another place. If you've watched any of my previous reaction videos, that is exactly how I like to experience this music. I look at the artwork, I read the song titles and liner notes, and I let the themes unfold in my head and create my own story using the base the artist has placed in front of me. Fantasy and dungeon synth have a symbiotic relationship. Reading a fantasy, sci-fi, or horror novel with the appropriate ambient music playing can enhance the experience and enjoyment of both pieces of art. When I'm working on my own writing, I will curate lists of songs and albums to put me in the right mindset for the tone I'm trying to write. And playing Dungeons & Dragons with the Fenwalker album in the background is about as magical as you can get as far as I'm concerned. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe and click the notification button below to be updated when I upload new videos. Until next time, take care.